Very likely one of the most famous games for the Commodore Amiga, or at least one of the most famous top-down running gun games for the Commodore Amiga. This masterpiece, which is of course the Chaos Engine, was originally released for the Amiga in 1993 by the legendary Bitmap Brothers, who prior to this had already established a good fan base for their work of Speedball 1 and 2, Xenon 2, and the very awesome Gods, as well as several other games. The Bitmap Brothers games were known to be difficult. Renegade Software published their games, which were actually the Bitmap Brothers behind the scenes. So why is the Chaos Engine likely one of the most loved Amiga games? Well, simply if you love top-down running gun games with a Victorian steampunk aesthetic, complete with thumping early 90s electro-industrial music, something along the lines of Pretty Hate Machine by Nine Inch Nails, which is packed with immense difficulty, you will likely love the Chaos Engine. Sure, there are many other games of this top-down genre on the Amiga, but very few matches the greatness of the Chaos Engine. It's a fast, beautiful looking game, even more beautiful if you run this through a Philips CRT monitor like I once did. It's just one of those games which is still amazingly playable today. The structure of the game is simple, 4 worlds and a few levels in each world. The good thing with this game is that we can have the CPU playing as player 2, which is actually good to have around. We can also collect money in the game in order to upgrade weapons and improve other aspects of the character as you progress in the game. The storyline is very intriguing. A time traveller from the future gets stuck in Victorian England. He loses his technology to a Royal Society inventor, who then changes the timeline and creates a futuristic Victorian England. With this, the technology is used to create monsters and everything else that attacks you. You have a choice of several characters to play in this game, mainly characters who are willing to stop the chaos reigning in England in return for financial gain. That is the basic premise of the Chaos Engine. I will note here that a couple of versions of the game was actually renamed as Soldiers of Fortune for the American market at the time. So as always, we're taking a look at every port from the original Amiga game and finding out which version is actually the very best version. First up then, we have got the Atari ST's conversion of the Chaos Engine. So firstly, to play the game you would have need at least 1 meg of RAM upgrade to play, or an STE model, Atari ST. So firstly, you will notice that this is actually a nicely detailed game. Although the colour palette is a little on the dull side, there is a few things missing here though. Obviously we have a lack of in-game music with this version, so you can no longer bop away while shooting hordes of monsters. On the contrary to the original Amiga release, we are also missing sampled speech when collecting particular items in the game, which was down to hardware limitations. The sound effects which are included do sound a little dated for this game compared to other versions of it. It has been argued that the Atari ST version is one of the easiest around to play, so if you fancy having less of a challenge, then this is for you. One of the annoyances here is that it just doesn't flow as well as the source material itself. It is slower and does tend to be choppy with low frame rates compared to other versions in this list. Overall, I definitely wouldn't say the ST port is a bad game, it's just that much better versions of the game were available. The Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version of the Chaos Engine was actually renamed to Soldiers of Fortune for the American market, but this however is the same game. Microprose released this for Europe back in '94 and Spectrum Holobyte released it for America in 1993. Now you will notice that something looks different here compared to the Amiga's version. I couldn't place why it was, it's actually the HUD which is different here. The original game had it placed on the bottom complete with imagery of the characters you was playing as, whereas the Super Nintendo or Famicom has actually got this at the top, and the layout is very different too. Although if this is the version you have played, then I suppose this all looks normal to you. So what can I say, it's a fairly good port. We have voice samples here and the colours used are really nice here too, which are complemented with fairly nice sprite designs. I particularly liked the introduction screen with the dinosaur laid out on the floor. This really looked awesome. Now personally I was not a big fan of the music at all with this conversion. I felt it was actually more of a downgrade from the Amiga's version. The reason this is because the SNES had less audio memory than the Amiga, so this was the compromise here. The game plays fairly well, although I did actually experience some frame drops from time to time here, nothing too significant though. Something else I actually thought looked really impressive with this version is when I let a bomb explode once I bumped into it, the screen flash, and that looked really awesome. The computer's player 2 AI was pretty good here, but generally though, this was a fairly tough version of the game. Okay, so yes, the music throughout the IBM PC compatible conversion isn't the best, but I will argue it sounds better than Super Nintendo's version did. The speech samples are pretty clear here too in comparison with the SNES game. The game scrolls fairly good with a little less lag than the other two versions in this video so far. Colours used here aren't too bright but not too dull either. Overall, a fairly good version with nicely detailed sprites, just seriously let down by the slow paced music.
Special power, special power.
This is another platform where America and Europe had different names for the game, but the same game. This is the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis conversion, which is pretty damn good. I will always compare Mega Drive to SNES because they are the same generation, and of course they're both 16-bit consoles. Now, why is this better than the SNES version? Well, firstly, the all-important music sounds much sharper and clearer here. A little more oomph to it, if you will. It comes with voice samples too, only it sounds so much clearer on the Mega Drive, and pretty comparable with the Amiga's version. In terms of colour, this isn't as bright as the SNES's version, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, the Amiga game uses duller colours. Just like a couple of different versions of this game in this list, having a joypad layout means we have dedicated buttons to release special powers such as bullet bursts, rather than having a traditional joystick and hold it down on fire button to make this happen, so it just makes it much easier to play. I found that controlling my characters were really nice here. Some versions felt a little wooden, but here this feels really nice when moving in all 8 directions. A solid port, and I really enjoyed my time with this version. Shooting at notes also looked particularly good here as they flash lightning. I will note here that the Sega Mega Drive version even comes with an option menu where we can actually change difficulty levels, so this is very useful if you don't like the challenge of the Chaos Engine as much. Now, sadly, I cannot get the in-game sound to work with this Acorn Archimedes 2000 released by Arcomp. I can assure you though that the in-game music is very good here. You can hear the quality of music just by the startup screen alone. This is likely on par with the Commodore Amiga's original version. In terms of visuals, it's kind of presented visually as a mix between the Amiga's OCS and AGA versions combined. It's not too dull in colour, neither is it too bright. It controls really well, although I was playing this on a keyboard for this video. Next up, we have the original version of the Chaos Engine for the Amiga OCS and ECS, or the Amiga 500 and 600 computers, where this legendary game started its life. As can be expected, and through its legendary status, this is a good sturdy game that gave Amiga games an almost new standard in terms of presentation and design. Is it perfect though? Well, some will argue that it is a smooth game to play in terms of frame rates. Some will argue that it's not perfect in smoothness compared to other versions. Personally, I did find it suffering from frame drops every now and again, but I have known much worse. Is it really bad to play though? Well, no, not at all. It's a great game. I am just being nitpicky here. Of course, we have the thumping iconic electro-industrial music here, which in my opinion is the best version of the music so far in this list. Now, some will argue that the colours used in this original OCS and ECS release are dull in comparison to the next couple of versions. Some will argue it's supposed to look darker and some not. Really, I think it's down to personal taste in terms of colours. Regardless, the attention to detail here is incredible. Amiga OCS or ECS owners would need 1 meg upgrade to run this game. Just remember, although different versions released on the Amiga are debated to date by mainly older people pretending they are still in the 1990s somewhere, this is a subjective discussion and my personal opinion here. For anybody who gives me a hard time over this, I will be linking you to a special video that I uploaded. Now again, this is a controversial one. As I mentioned in the original OCS and ECS release, I personally find the Amiga AGA version nicer to look at. I mean, it's pretty much the same game, it's upgraded the new enhanced colours used here. Now, I don't think it's overly colourful to the extent of something like Super Mario World, but something I do like seeing with this version, which released a few months after the original game back in 1993, was this awesome colour palette used on brass objects such as keys. Of course, the whole steampunk aesthetic is primarily centered around brass, and I think this really makes this AGA release stand out for that alone. Something else which really stood out for me was the bugs, which here look awesome in an almost metallic blue looking colour, whereas the original release looked fairly washed out with these. Some will argue that the AGA release was nothing more than a gimmick, whereas there were specific games designs for Amiga AGA computers such as the awesome shoot 'em up Banshee. I just felt that this looked better in many ways. Even the nodes as they flash lightning after activating them looked nicer and more colours used. The whole use of more colours being used seemed to make things look more defined too. In terms of the original look, I can see why fans would prefer that look over this version. For years, people have argued that the Chaos engine could never be coded and working for the Commodore 64. Although this is actually a 2024 preview I'm playing here, this looks really promising. I won't mention that the so-called remastered 2013 Windows, Mac and Linux release, as this was just a copy of an Amiga game, but only with widescreen. This, however, although fairly rough at the moment, undeniably, this scroll's amazing and the music is pretty good for an 8-bit version of the game. AI for Player 2 is well off at the moment, but remember this is just a preview release, and so certain things aren't going to be perfect here. I personally hope this gets a full release at some point, and the coder behind this port is commended for pulling this off. I will also mention that there was a fairly good port for the Atari Jaguar, which released very recently.
Sometime in the last century, an experimenter in time
And in first place, my personal favourite version is actually the Amiga CD32's 1994 release. So, although introduction music and weapon upgrade screens have different music, it's not overly that bad as some might say it is. Of course, the game itself and how it looks is pretty much the same as the Amiga's AGA version. There are a few things which make this version better. Firstly, it's undeniable that the music in-game is superior. After all, this was released on Compact Disc, and we actually have more clarity with sound here. It all sounds majorly enhanced. For example, as I'm playing through the first world or the English countryside, I can hear birds tweeting in the background, which is another audio layer. Combined with the electro-industrial music, it really adds an extra piece to the game itself. The speech samples also sound much clearer here too. I found this version also fairly smooth to play compared with everything else here in this list. There was very little frame drop issues here too. Now, one of the biggest changes is a fully animated introduction complete with the storyline being told to us rather than doing the old-fashioned thing called reading. I think this looks great and just adds a little more depth to the game itself. It's also fairly good to control. Like I say, during the Mega Drive's version, the Amiga CD32 came with a joypad and so dedicated buttons to use for games like this where we no longer had to hold down fire button to release special weapons was actually implemented here, and it's just much easier to control. So that's it for my ranking of various different versions of the Chaos Engine today. More than likely, a lot of people was out there in full rage because I didn't put the original Amiga OCS and ECS version in top spot, but that's my choice, and as I said, this is a very subjective matter for a highly controversial topic, really. So which version did you have back in the day? Did you enjoy the Chaos Engine, or did you refer to it as a very overrated game? Personally, I love the Chaos Engine, and it's right up there with my all-time favourite Amiga titles. Anyways, it will be good to hear what you got to say in the comments. Just be very kind, like you normally are. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.